Welcome back to the archive. I'm Paul, and today I want to start with something that sounds simple, but isn't. When people say the medieval church was powerful, they usually mean it in a vague way. Spiritually powerful, morally influential, important to people's inner lives. That is true, but it is not the whole picture. The medieval church was not just spiritually powerful, it was a state. Not like a state, not similar to a state, not a metaphor, a state. It collected taxes, it ran courts, it built and maintained hospitals, it educated the clerks who ran every royal administration in Europe, it conducted diplomacy between kingdoms, it owned land, more land than any single king. In England around 1200, the church owned roughly 1/3 of all cultivated land in the country. 1/3. And it administered that land not through bishops and cathedrals, but through priories, abbeys, and monasteries scattered across the country, in every market town, at every crossroads, on every major road. If you lived in a medieval English town, and a man named Edmund did, you paid taxes to the church just as you paid taxes to the king. You went to the church's court just as you went to the royal court. You used the church's mill to grind your grain. You educated your children in the church's school. When you were sick, you went to the church's hospital. When you died, the church buried you. This was not a religion that existed alongside the state. This was a religion that was the state. And when Edmund got into a dispute with his local priory over market dues, he did not just have a religious problem, he had a political problem, a legal problem, an economic problem, and eventually a problem that touched every person in his town. That is what the archive held today. Let's open the record. There is a man I keep returning to in this archive. His name was Edmund. Not a king, not a bishop, a mayor. The mayor of a small English market town around 1220. This meant Edmund was, by the standards of his time, a successful man. He was a merchant, probably cloth or wool, the backbone of English trade in the 13th century. He was literate enough to keep accounts. He was trusted enough by his fellow townspeople to speak for them. He was not poor, he was not powerful. He was exactly the kind of man who understood, from long experience, how his world actually worked. And his world worked like this. At the center of his town, the priory. Not a cathedral, this was not a great city, a priory. A community of Augustinian canons, a prior at their head, living under monastic rule. The priory owned the mill where Edmund ground his grain. The priory owned the market where Edmund sold his cloth. The priory collected the toll on every transaction, a percentage of every sale, every market day, every year. The priory ran the court where disputes were settled. The prior sat beside the king's justices when they came to town, not as a witness, not as a petitioner, but as their equal. The priory ran the school where the town's clerks were trained. The priory maintained the road that brought merchants to the market. And every year, at harvest, at Christmas, at Easter, Edmund paid his dues to the priory, just as surely as he paid his royal taxes. This was the deal. The priory provided the infrastructure. Edmund used it. Edmund paid for it. This was not unusual. This was not oppressive, or at least it was not seen as oppressive, for most of Edmund's life. It was simply how things worked. The church built the hospital. The church ran the school. The church maintained the roads. The church judged the disputes. In return, the town paid its dues. Edmund understood this. He had grown up with it. His father had paid the same dues. His grandfather had paid them. The arrangement went back further than anyone could remember. And for most of Edmund's life, it had worked. Until it didn't. Now, let me show you what the medieval church actually looked like as an institution, because most people carry a picture of the medieval church that is half right. The picture: a pope in Rome, bishops in great cathedrals, monks copying manuscripts in quiet scriptoria, priests hearing confession in village churches. That picture is real, but it misses the other half of the institution, the half that made it a state. Begin with money. The church collected the tithe, 1/10 of every person's income, every year, to the church. This was not a voluntary donation. This was a tax, enforceable in court, with penalties for non-payment. In England around 1000, this tithe was collected at every level. The parish priest collected from his parishioners, the bishop collected from his parishes, the pope collected from the whole of Christendom. It was a tax system of extraordinary sophistication, more reliable, more geographically comprehensive than most royal tax systems of the same period. The church also owned land, vast amounts of land, and land in the medieval world meant income. It meant tenants paying rent, it meant mills collecting tolls, it meant markets generating fees, it meant courts collecting fines. The church's income from its land alone exceeded the income of most European kings. Then there were the courts. The church ran an entirely separate legal system, canon law, operating in parallel to the royal courts. Church courts handled marriage disputes, inheritance of wills, contracts made under oath, the behavior of the clergy, heresy, usury, the lending of money at interest, and, critically, any dispute that touched church property or church dues, which meant that if you had a dispute with your local priory about market tolls, you did not go to the king's court. You went to the church's court, where the church's law applied, where the church's judges presided, where the church's penalties were enforced. And the church's most severe penalty was not a fine, it was not imprisonment, it was excommunication. Expulsion from the church, from all its sacraments, from all its community, from all its protection. For a medieval Christian, a person who believed, genuinely and completely, that the sacraments were the mechanism of salvation, excommunication was not a legal inconvenience. It was a sentence of spiritual death, and potentially of actual damnation. This is the first mechanism. The church was not a spiritual institution with some political power. It was a political institution with spiritual legitimacy. And that spiritual legitimacy was the source of its most powerful tool, the power to exclude someone from God. Edmund knew all of this. He had lived inside this system his entire life. He had paid his dues, he had used the court, he had sent his children to the priory school. He was, by any measure, a good son of the church, which made what happened next all the more surprising.
The dispute began simply, as disputes usually do. Edmund was the mayor of his town. The prior was the head of the priory that owned the market Edmund traded in. The prior held rights over the market dues, a toll on every transaction, collected on market day. For years, the amount of the toll had been fixed by custom, a penny here, a halfpenny there, predictable, manageable. Then the prior changed the calculation. New fees, additional charges, a different accounting of what was owed. Edmund and the town's merchants did not accept it. They argued, formally, through the proper channels, that the new fees exceeded what the custom allowed. The custom was old. It had been written down. The merchants knew what it said. They had the records. The prior had the court. Because the dispute was about church property and church dues, it went to the church court, where the prior's position was heard by the prior's peers. The merchants of the town presented their evidence. They cited the custom. They showed their records. They lost. Of course they lost. It was the church's court. But they did not go quietly. They refused to pay the new fees. They refused to use the priory's mill. They refused to attend the market on the prior's terms. 24 men from the town were imprisoned in Bedford until they submitted. 10 were excommunicated over a dispute about the fees owed at a town wedding. The church claimed the full traditional amount. The townspeople had paid less. The prior made them answer for it. And in 1229, when the king himself was passing through the town and the prior asked him to intervene, The townspeople said something that was recorded in the priory's annals and has survived to this day. They said they would rather go to hell than submit to these demands. Let that settle for a moment. These were medieval Christians, people for whom hell was not a figure of speech, people who had been taught from childhood that excommunication led to damnation. And they looked at the prior and the prior's accounts and the prior's court and said, "We would rather go to hell than pay this." That is what the archive holds today. Not the story of a dispute about money, the story of a moment when the fear of hell was outweighed by the sense of injustice on earth. Edmund was in that moment. He stood in the record as a man who knew what he owed, and who knew when what was being demanded was not the same thing.
Now, let me show you what excommunication actually meant in the life of a medieval town. Because the word is familiar, the reality is not. To be excommunicated was to be expelled from the Christian community, not symbolically, literally. You could not receive the sacraments. No Mass, no confession, no absolution of your sins, no last rites when you were dying. You could not enter a church. You could not be buried in consecrated ground. If you died excommunicate, your body could be, and sometimes was, exhumed from the churchyard and dumped outside it. And the people around you, your neighbors, your trading partners, your friends, were forbidden to communicate with you, to eat with you, to drink with you, to do business with you. Anyone who associated with an excommunicate risked their own standing with the church. And if the church chose to extend the sentence, it could issue an interdict not just on one person, but on an entire community. An interdict on a town meant no church services, no masses, no baptisms, no weddings blessed by the church, no burial rites. The whole town cut off from the sacraments until the dispute was resolved. This is what made excommunication something different from any royal punishment. A king could fine you, a king could imprison you, a king could execute you, but a king could not threaten your soul. Only the church could do that, and in a world where people believed, genuinely, completely, without irony, that the sacraments were the mechanism of salvation, that hell was real, that dying without absolution meant damnation, the threat of excommunication was the most powerful weapon available to any institution, because it worked not through fear of pain or loss of property, but through fear of eternal consequences. Edmund understood this. When 10 of his fellow townspeople were excommunicated, he watched what happened. Their wives could not take communion. Their children could not be baptized with difficulty. When their parents died, the burial rites became a source of anxiety and negotiation. The people around them stepped back, not out of cruelty, out of their own fear. To be seen associating with an excommunicate was to court the same fate. The social machinery of a small town began to operate against the men who had refused to pay the prior's fees. This was not the prior's doing directly. This was the mechanism working as it was designed to work. The community enforced the sentence because the community believed in the theology behind it, and that is what made it so powerful. The prior did not need soldiers. He did not need walls. He did not need a prison. He had something better. He had the belief of every person in the town that the sentence was real. Edmund faced this. He watched the mechanism operate. He felt the pressure. He understood that the question was no longer just about market dues. It was about whether the fear of eternal damnation was sufficient to make injustice acceptable. For most of Edmund's neighbors, eventually, it was. They submitted. They paid. They swore an oath of loyalty to the prior. The king came. The matter was settled. A fine of £60 was paid. The custom was restated. The dispute ended. On the surface. But something had changed. Edmund had seen the mechanism clearly, not the theology,
the mechanism. He had seen that the church's power, its real power, its power to move people, to change their behavior, to override their sense of justice, did not come from God directly. It came from the belief of people that it came from God directly. These are different things. The church's court had ruled against the townspeople, not because the townspeople were wrong about what the customs said. They had the records. The customs said what they said it said. The church's court had ruled against them because the court was the church's court, and the dispute was with the church. The weapon of excommunication had been deployed, not against heretics, not against criminals, not against those who had broken the laws of God, but against people who had refused to pay fees that they believed exceeded what they owed. And it had worked. Not because the people were wrong, because the people were afraid. Edmund saw this. He continued to live in his town. He continued to pay his dues. He continued to attend Mass. He was a practical man. He was not a reformer. He was not looking for a fight he could not win. But he had seen behind the mechanism. He had seen that the sentence of excommunication was a legal tool deployed in a legal dispute, dressed in the language of salvation and the terror of hell. He had seen that the power of the church to threaten the souls of ordinary people was being used, in this case, in this dispute, in this town, to win an argument about money. He did not say this aloud. He was not writing a treatise. He was not nailing anything to a door. He was just a man who had watched something happen and now knew what he knew. And that knowledge, quietly held, passed from neighbor to neighbor, accumulated over generations, is the third record in this archive.
The medieval church did not end in a single revolution. It did not end when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door at Wittenberg in 1517. Luther's action was a crystallization, a moment when something that had been accumulating for 200 years finally found its words. The accumulation was made of Edmunds, millions of them, people who had seen the mechanism clearly enough to understand the difference between spiritual authority and institutional power. People who had been told that the church's demands were God's demands, and who had watched those demands applied in a legal dispute about market fees. People who had been told that excommunication was the sentence of God, and who had watched it deployed as a negotiating tactic in a dispute about money. The church's power rested on a foundation that was also its greatest vulnerability. The foundation was belief, not the belief that God existed. That belief was not in question. The belief that the institution of the church was the authentic representative of God's authority on earth, that the Pope's words were God's words, that the bishop's court was God's court, that the sentence of excommunication was God's sentence. For centuries, this belief had been nearly universal, challenged in individual cases by specific heretics, by specific schisms, but never broadly, never widely, never at the level of ordinary people in ordinary towns going about their ordinary lives. Edmund was not a heretic. He believed in God. He believed in the sacraments. He believed in the church. He just no longer believed quite as completely as before that every act of the institution was an act of God. This is the crack that the Reformation eventually broke through. Not Luther's theology, not the printing press, not the politics of German princes. Those things mattered, but they worked because the ground was already prepared. The ground was prepared by Edmund, by the people of Dunstable who said they would rather go to hell than submit, by Ralph the wine merchant in London who was excommunicated and found that his neighbors kept trading with him anyway, by 1,000 small towns where the church court ruled in the church's favor one too many times, and where the sentence of excommunication was applied once too often in a dispute about money. and where a mayor or a merchant or a farmer quietly noted the difference between what the institution claimed to be and what he had seen it do. This is the third mechanism, the end from within. Not a revolution, not a single act, not even a conscious decision. The slow, accumulating recognition that the institution demanding obedience in God's name was not always, not in every case, not in every dispute, actually acting on God's behalf. That recognition could not be unrecognized, and once enough people carried it quietly in enough towns, in enough markets, in enough manorial courts, the moment came when one man found the words for it and nailed them to a door, and everything changed.
Let me take you to the last room in this section of the archive, the room where all three records are laid out together. England and France, 1100 to 1300. 2 centuries, 3 mechanisms. First, the church as state. Not a metaphor, a parallel government operating across every country in Europe. It collected taxes, it ran courts, it owned land, it educated the clerks who ran every royal administration. Its most powerful tool was not its armies. It had no armies to speak of. Its most powerful tool was spiritual legitimacy, the claim that its authority came from God, and therefore to resist the church was to resist God. Second, excommunication as weapon. Not a spiritual sanction applied to spiritual offenses, a legal weapon deployed in legal disputes, dressed in the language of salvation. The power to exclude someone from the community of Christians, from the sacraments, from social life, from commerce, from burial. Effective not because the church had soldiers to enforce it, but because the people around the excommunicated believed in its spiritual reality and enforced it themselves. Edmund watched this happen. He watched his neighbors step back from the men who had refused to pay the prior's fees, not out of cruelty, out of belief. Third, the end from within. Not Luther, not the printing press, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 Edmunds who had seen the mechanism clearly, who had watched excommunication deployed in a dispute about money, who had seen the church's court rule in the church's favor, who had not stopped believing in God, but had begun, quietly, to distinguish between God and the institution that claimed to speak for him. None of this was designed. A prior raised his market fees. 10 men refused to pay. They were excommunicated. They submitted. The prior won. And somewhere in that town, in that market, in that court, in that moment, a mayor named Edmund saw something he could not unsee. And 200 years later, a monk named Martin Luther found the words for it.
That is what the archive held today. Not the story of popes and crusades and cathedral architecture. The story of a man who paid his dues to the priory every year of his life, who used the church's mill and the church's court and sent his children to the church's school, who got into a dispute about market fees and watched his neighbors be excommunicated for refusing to pay what they believed they did not owe, and of a church that believed its authority was permanent and discovered, slowly, that authority built on fear has a limited lifespan. If this changed the way you see something, share it with one person. That is how this archive grows. And if you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, the doors are open. Next time, I'll take you to a different shelf entirely. The archive is deep, and what's on the next shelf you won't expect. I'm Paul, archivist of Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Stay curious and keep reading.